group of activists are being held in detention after their boat was intercepted by Israeli forces while trying to deliver aid to Gaza. Don Rothwell is a professor of international law with a focus on the law of the sea from the Australian National University, and he joins me now. Don, thank you so much for your time this morning. As we just said, you specialise in the law of the sea. This blockade by Israel in the waters off of Gaza has been heavily scrutinised. Could you take us through Israel's legal basis for this blockade and its intercepting of these vessels?
Well, Israel's had in place a blockade of various forms off the coast of Gaza, which intercepts and impacts upon vessels that are seeking to reach Gaza, and that's been in place for over 20 years now. And indeed, it's been heavily contested legally. At the moment, though, we're in a slightly different legal position because, of course, Israel is an occupying power in Gaza as a result of its extensive military operations against Hamas, which is now running up to nearly a 2-year period. And while Israel can legally put in place a blockade, there's also an exception to a blockade where the use of a blockade is seeking to starve civilians and seeking to deny civilians access to food. And of course, one of the justifications for this flotilla was to bring humanitarian aid and supplies to the civilians in Gaza. So in simple legal terms, Israel has a right to put in place a blockade, but the blockade can be legally circumvented if humanitarian aid has been delivered, which is what the flotilla was seeking to achieve.
These activists say that they were intercepted in international waters, as we've been reporting this morning. Can you take us through the concept of freedom of navigation? What rights does that presume?
Well, freedom of navigation is one of the fundamental tenets of the law of the sea. And of course, we hear the Australian government, the Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, the Foreign Minister constantly restate the importance of that principle for Australia in the context of the South China Sea. And so the freedom of navigation applies throughout all of the Mediterranean. So when you have the principles of this blockade coming up against the freedom of navigation, you have this really significant clash of legal principles. And we've seen statements made by European ministers and the legal representatives of the flotilla making the obvious point that this interception of the flotilla well off the Gazan coast, reports suggesting that the interceptions that commenced over 24 hours ago were occurring between 60 to 70 miles off the Gazan coast, were certainly within international waters where the freedom of navigation would exist.
What do we know about why Israel boarded this flotilla in the first place? This is, of course, not the first time that this has happened. What's their justification for boarding these ships?
Well, Gaza's had in place, Israel, I should say, has had in place an air, sea and land blockade with respect to Gaza. And that's been a very, very tight blockade ever since Israel commenced its military operations in Gaza since 7 October 2023. And of course, Israel's justification is that they do not in any way wish these vessels to enter Gaza. And indeed, some of the statements that were being made by Israel to ward off the flotilla vessels was that the vessels were entering an active military operations zone. And obviously there's truth in that, in the sense that any civilian vessel that could get very close to the Gazan coastline could easily get caught up in Israeli military operations, and that could result in loss of life. So there's a legitimate security concern at one level, but once again, these interceptions were taking place at a significant distance off the Gazan coast in the Mediterranean.
This flotilla was accompanied by Italian and Greek warships throughout its journey. What does that mean? Do we know? And was there any potential for those vessels to be intercepted by Israel at all?
Well, look, it certainly suggested a ramping up of the engagement by certain European states. This is the first time ever, to my knowledge, that these flotillas have been accompanied by naval vessels from other European powers. And there was always some potential that that could create something of a flashpoint once the Israeli Defense Force began to intercept and interdict these vessels starting 24 hours ago. All of the reports suggest that the Italian and Greek naval vessels, they stayed clear of that Israeli Defense Force interceptions. But it certainly indicates, I think, that European states are going very tired of the way in which Israel is keeping such an iron grip around Gaza, certainly from a maritime perspective. And so we'll need to wait and see as to whether or not any other flotilla missions emerge and what level of military support they might receive from some other European naval powers.